Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, Your Elevator Pitch, How to Convey What You Do and Why It Matters. My name is Melissa Varga, and I'm the Science Network Outreach Associate at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you for joining us. Today's presenters will explain what makes an effective elevator pitch and how to adjust your pitch when talking to different audiences. And after all of our presenters have spoken, there will be time for Q&A at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our three presenters, Sean Meyer, Jalonne White-Newsome, and Ted Parson. Sean Meyer is the Manager of Strategic Campaigns for the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He has worked as Project Director for the Security Policy Working Group in senior marketing and communications positions for a marketing and advertising firm and with other private sector organizations. Earlier in his career, Sean served in D.C. as the coordinator for the Congressional Roundtable on Post-Cold War Relations, National Field Coordinator for the UCS National Security Program, and as a lobbyist and field organizer for the Professionals Coalition for Nuclear Arms Control. Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome is a federal policy analyst for We Act for Environmental Justice, staffing their Washington, D.C. legislative office. In this capacity, she engages in advocacy and education on Capitol Hill while monitoring administrative actions to ensure an environmental justice perspective is included in legislative and regulatory conversations on a variety of environmental issues. Before We Act, Jalonne was the first Kendall Fellow with UCS's D.C. office, researching issues of climate change and health, which she continues to engage in today. Ted Parson is Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law and Faculty Co-Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the University of California, Los Angeles. He studies international environmental law and policy, the role of science and technology in policymaking, and the political economy of regulation. In addition to his academic positions, Ted has worked and consulted for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Office of Technology Assessment of the U.S. Congress, among others. He is a member of the UCS National Advisory Board and a Science Network member. In former lives, he was a professional classical musician and an organizer of grassroots environmental groups. And one last housekeeping note before we get started. Feel free to send us your questions throughout the presentation through the chat box in the bottom left of your screen, and we'll try to address as many of your questions as possible at the end. And from here, Sean will start us off. Take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. Trying to move the slide here, Melissa. It's not seeming to be. Can you control the slides for me? Thank you. My job today is to discuss why scientists and experts like you need an elevator pitch and define what they are, and to lay out some of the basic do's and don'ts for coming up with one. Next, please. I'm confident that everyone on this call has been at some function or party or at some point in their life has been asked many, many times the age-old question, so what do you do? And the term elevator pitch can mean different things to different people, but lots of people think of it as the answer to that what do you do question. And that's really a helpful way to approach this as we discuss the importance of being able to talk about your work and your research. But that definition is really limited because in the policy and advocacy world, one's elevator pitch could just as easily be the answer to the question of what do you want. It's your ask of a policymaker or their staff, or what I, as a grassroots organizer, might say to you, to any one of you, to convince you to take time out of your busy day to lobby your member of Congress or your state legislator, or for that matter, attend this webinar. And today we'll certainly spend some time discussing all of these, the importance of being able to quickly and powerfully communicate what you do and why it matters, but also how you as a citizen scientist can be a better advocate for not only your work, but also the policies and issues that you care about, and in short, how to get your point across quickly and effectively. Next, please. So let's start with what matters most, knowing and being able to articulate why the person you are communicating with and trying to influence should care. The reason one might care will, of course, differ greatly depending on who you're talking to and in what context. But the key is to take the time in advance to ask that question generally of yourself or your work. And a great way to answer it is just to ask why you care. What led you to become a climate scientist or a physicist or a biologist or whatever it is you do professionally? Or another way is to, what do you excitedly tell your spouse or partner about when you get home from the office? And I'm hoping as a small exercise right now in our attempt to always seek feedback that some of you might take some time, a few seconds right now, to tell us in the chat section sort of how we answered that question of why you should care about this webinar. What is it that we did or said that led you to take time out of your day to attend today? That would be very helpful to us. Next slide, please. So let's talk about time, and really when it comes to making pitches and persuading people how little of it we have. How many of us read every email in our inbox or listen patiently to every unsolicited phone call we get at home or at the office? None of us, right? With so many competing interests and only so many hours in the day, we constantly make nearly instantaneous judgments about the things that we will focus on and those that we will ignore. As many of us know, there's a whole science today behind effective email subject lines, and telemarketers and issue campaigners like us struggle to figure out those first few words of a phone call before the person hangs up or decides, I'm not interested. In short, how do we grab someone's attention and keep it? So for example, when speaking to an exceptionally busy legislative aide on Capitol Hill, opening with phrases like, I'm a constituent, a longtime supporter of your boss, and I'm hoping you have just 2 minutes, will likely be more effective than, say, I'm calling to complain about your boss's vote on a recent bill. That tends to be a turnoff to that busy aide. Next slide, please. The term pitch really suggests a one-way activity, but it really is about starting a conversation. And what better way to do that than ask one or more questions, such as, do you know that my research has found, or what do you know about blank, or have you ever heard about? And a good exercise is to ask yourself, what are those most interesting, sort of coolest aspects of the work you do and how it applies to the real world and how it might apply to that person you're speaking to. But here's the deal with questions. You have to want to listen to what the other person has to say in return. Nothing is so obvious as a self-absorbed person staring blankly at you as you're speaking, impatiently waiting to make their next clever point, paying really no mind to what you're talking about. Next slide, please. So who doesn't like to talk about that great movie they watched last weekend or the book you stayed up last night until 3 a.m. reading? Stories provide meaning, and they come in all shapes and sizes. They help us to make sense of the world. And your work and concerns are no different. As I spend my days working to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons, I'm constantly trying to tell stories with characters and plot lines and drama, and, of course, when it comes to nuclear weapons, hopefully happy endings. And our life and our life's work has all these things, and effective communication should strive to bring these storytelling elements out. Next, please. And this is just a throwaway slide, just a little pitch for my beloved Boston Red Sox. So next slide, please. So before I'm going to end my section giving my own pitch, but before I get to that, I want to just sort of run through some very general principles, and I know Jalonne and Ted are going to sort of get into the depths of some of these things in more depth. But I just wanted to sort of lay some of them out before I give my own pitch. Never be afraid to say something that people aren't expecting, of course with the caveat of without coming off as a crazy person. Always strive to keep things short and simple. This is not a talk or a lecture. This is the art of persuasion. Always tend to focus on the big picture and save the details for later, or once you've grabbed that attention and grabbed them in. And again, focus on why it matters, not what you do per se. Always make it personal, and please avoid corporate speak, market speak, cliches and buzz phrases. There's many words out there in the lexicon that people simply have no idea what it means, and it tends to be a turnoff. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close with my elevator pitch, and again, in the interest of always seeking feedback, be it positive or negative. I would love any feedback you have via the chat function. So Sean, what do you do for a living? Well, my wife Kate and I have the distinction of being people who often don't get invited back to cocktail parties. I do the bang, nuclear weapons, and she does the whimper, climate change. Or put another way, we are both existential threat prevention specialists. My job is to remind people that these incredibly destructive weapons exist on the planet. They're ready to be used at a moment's notice, and to convince you and your elected officials that they don't make us safe, and we have to work hard toward ridding them from the planet. So let me ask you something. Do you have any idea roughly how many nuclear weapons exist on the planet and who has most of them? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa. And again, I'd appreciate that was, of course, an abbreviated elevator pitch of what I do, but I'll turn it back over to Melissa or directly to Jalonne. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. That was awesome. And thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. And I've been asked to share a couple of specific examples and maybe some strategies where having your quote-unquote pitch is really important. So I'm not sure about you, but I was kind of brainwashed that, you know, as a scientist or a technical person, once you have published in a peer-reviewed journal, your communication is over. You are done. You have reached the mountaintop. That's it. But what I've learned is that most regular people don't pick up those peer-reviewed journals, and if you want your science to get beyond the typical folks that read those journals, you need to communicate. And why it's so important to communicate science is, of course, a lot of the issues that Ted just laid out, but convincing people to care about something, bringing them to action, or really just making all the data and the pretty graphs mean something to people. And so these types of communications can, of course, happen in an elevator. They can happen via Skype, phone, in the public forum, a lot of different places. So, you know, what do we do with that communication, and how do we use it? And especially in the audiences that I'm sure many of you all talk to, they're not the same. They're not scientists. And so in my job as an environmental advocate, I talk to a lot of people, but for time's sake, I'm just going to focus on three main groups. Those folks that kind of deal with legislative policy and rules and regulations, so I'll kind of characterize them as the Capitol Hill staffers and the governmental agency type folks. The second group that I want to talk about quickly are those communities that are impacted by something, and I'm going to, of course, kind of lean towards those that are impacted by their environment. And then the third group is kind of the group that might assemble of non-scientists in a public forum or a community meeting, and I want to address why pitches are so important in these three facets. So I don't mean any harm, but I'm going to call our Capitol Hill types, I'm going to call this group talking to the suits, because again, the goals with most of these conversations is you're trying to share a perspective, get support, or simply educate. And so what I've found very quickly is that it's important to kind of define what you're talking about and make no assumptions. Typically, when I go into offices on the Hill or even within the agency, people don't understand what environmental justice is. And so one of the mistakes that I often made was kind of assume that they knew what EJ was and just started ranting and raving about this particular law or this particular standard. So it's important to understand that those folks that you're talking to might not be familiar with your particular niche of science, and as well, they might have limited time, and it might not be a part of their priorities. So I'd say one of the strategies that I would really push is, again, don't assume, and make sure that you connect whatever your niche or your scientific area is with what they care about, because they have limited time. So whether it's the members' priority, if they're really concerned about saving the wetlands, make sure your science or whatever you're talking about relates to that. And also, always try and leave with an ask, something that you want from them, or an offer of your time or expertise. Now, what can come of this conversation, whether it's 3 minutes or 15 minutes, you can really define your success in a lot of different ways. This could be an outlet for your scientific work. The agency could use it. You could be brought in as a speaker, a future partner, It can help support some of your advocacy efforts. So there are a lot of different results that come from having a good pitch and really honing it in the 3 to 15 minutes that you typically have. So the next group that I want to talk about is what I've kind of termed selling the Girl Scout cookies. So I had an opportunity to sell cookies with my daughters this year, and I tell you, that fear of rejection is intense. And so I had this opportunity, I guess, to sell the cookies, in this case, talk to an impacted community, doing a little bit of door-to-door advocacy. So basically knocking on doors in an unfamiliar neighborhood to talk about science, public health, incineration, and climate change, all those huge topics to people that had no idea who I was. And so, of course, the goal was try to educate folks, but also encourage action. And so the challenge is, again, I wasn't a resident of this particular community, so I'm an outsider. The fact that sometimes people feel that if people are coming in from the outside to talk about certain issues that we're going to quote-unquote save them, and I call that the Superwoman Superman effect, that they're not able to take care of themselves because I have this scientist or this person that's coming in to tell me what I need to do to save myself. And then, of course, rejection, which could be, in some cases, getting the door slammed in your face. And so some of the strategies that I tried to employ when talking about this incinerator in a community next to mine was to really first take a minute to look around. Because I was talking about incineration and burning waste and the impacts on public health, what I noticed is that there were dozens of children everywhere. There was a playground. Every time I knocked on a door, there was, a kid coming to the door. So using that obvious connection between children's health and the fact that you have an incinerator, a couple of feet away from you, that was a strategy to get in. Also, I think it's important to, again, understand what their level is. Ask and start out with a question. Hey, do you understand, why this incinerator is in your community? Have things changed? Really try and understand what level they're at, because you'll be really surprised that folks really know a lot, but your job might be just to connect the dots and just to say, hey, you have an incinerator, you have a landfill, how is that connected to your overall health? And so I think sometimes the scientists, that is the cool thing that we get to do, is kind of take something intangible and make it tangible so folks can really digest it. And then I think it's also important to always leave something behind, whether it's a flyer, contact information, etc., so they can, again, follow up with the conversation. And, of course, one of the major results from selling the Girl Scout cookies is that, of course, you don't get rejected, hopefully, but that you, again, share some understanding, build some support, and, of course, become a new resource or ally to that particular community. And the last thing I want to share about you is building an all-star team. And I want to frame this around community meetings or public forums, or when you're kind of going in to share your science or research and you really don't know anyone, or you might not really be connected, but you need to garner some support or build a coalition, or you want to train people to talk about your research in a productive way. And so when I was in Detroit, and that's why, even though the Miami Heat, as an aside, is kind of, running the NBA right now, I am a Detroiter till I die, so I have to have my Detroit Bad Boys there. But as I was doing my research in Detroit, I had the opportunity to engage with a lot of different folks with those goals in mind. So I was trying to recruit senior citizens for my research, reach out to local health departments and other agencies and local city officials to really understand why climate change was so important, especially extreme heat. And so when I was talking in these different forums, there were many challenges, and this list is not exhaustive, but some of the general challenges can be, science can be overwhelming. I would say climate change, and people would totally clam up and their eyes would glare. Or people might not be interested. They might not think that you're credible. And one of the most important questions is, so what, I'm listening to you, and if I decide to do anything, will it actually matter? And so that's why I think some of these strategies really come into play. Again, whether you have 2 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, your pitch should contain some connection to the issue. So oftentimes I try to connect it with a personal story, whether it's related to that community or something where people can really kind of dig into it. The second piece is really showing the connections between how your research, your science, your work can not only support the work that they're doing, but maybe bring more resources or other benefits that they might not be able to see. For example, the Detroit Department of Health really hadn't done any work around climate and heat. And so after kind of hearing my presentation, it allowed them the opportunity to kind of say, hey, maybe we need to expand into this area of grant making and search out things that can kind of connect what this lady's talking about to the work and the advocacy and the outreach that we're already doing. So if you do your pitch well, you can have many results. Most importantly, not only building relationships that are beneficial to kind of get your science, quote unquote, out there, but making your science and research actionable that can actually and hopefully benefit the lives of others. So again, if you don't remember anything else, I'm sure our speakers will cover this, but the most important, I think, is connecting with your audience, researching your audience as much as you can. That's not always possible, but again, trying to, of course, make the complex as simple as possible. So with that, thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, it's over to me now. This is Ted Parson. Thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for signing on and spending your time talking with us today. My task is to talk about how you would communicate effectively for different audiences and situations. So how you would tune your remarks and presentation and pitch depending upon the setting. So let me start by noting that the chances you get to talk about your work and its importance vary a lot. I'm going to propose 4 things to think about, 4 characteristics on which opportunities to speak about your work vary that you should think about in deciding what you want to do and how you're going to prepare. These are kind of obvious, but I think they're still worth thinking through explicitly. And let me note what's going to become a frequently repeated message, and I've heard it already in Jalonne and Sean's presentations as well, the highlight on prepare. Effective communication is all about learnable skills. They respond to practice, they respond to preparation, and detailed preparation for the chances you're going to have is hugely important in determining your success. So here are the 4. How much time are you going to have? And that means you should do your best to think about both a best guess and a range of likely possibilities. Second, what do you want to achieve? The more that the people you're talking to are just like you, the more you're likely to share with them a strong understanding about why you're talking, and the more you're likely to agree about why you're talking. But on the other hand, and where it's relevant for our topic today, the more that the people you're talking to are different from you and are outside the normal group you speak to all the time in your professional life, the more important it is to think explicitly and clearly about what you're trying to achieve and how that relates to the needs and interests of your audience. And then the last 2 characteristics you think about, who are you talking to? I propose 2 big dimensions for thinking through who you're talking to. What do they know? What's their level of relevant knowledge in what you want to communicate to them? And as both Sean and Jalonne have emphasized so far, what do they care about? What are their aims, their needs, and responsibilities? As Jalonne said, this has both aspects of personal concern, what do they care about as a person, and often for some people you're trying to talk to, professional dimensions as well. What are their responsibilities? What's their authority? So let's look at these one by one. What's your available time? So important communication opportunities come in a really wide range of sizes, meaning durations. They can be very, very short, truly an elevator pitch, 10 or 15 seconds. For thinking about how to be effective in the shortest formats, I find a useful guideline is to think that 1 sentence of normal length and complexity without rushing takes about 5 seconds to say, maybe a couple more. So if you think about the time you have, that tells you how much you can say. A 10 or 15 second elevator ride is 2 or 3 sentences. Not too long, not too complex. You should prepare for the time you expect to have and prepare to cut it shorter or to use extra time well if you find that you get a little more or a little less than you expect. That means that you need to know ways to say what you want to that are as short as 2 or 3 not too complex sentences. In sort of the minimum format for effective communication, 1 sentence for what I know or the thing I want to say, and 1 sentence for why it matters. At the risk of being a broken record, that is all about preparation. Now, one risk in preparing to think about communicate effectively, maybe it's a risk I'm subject to more than most, is a kind of a magical thinking about time that I can still say everything I want to say, everything that's important about my message and my work, even if it's a short time. No, you can't do that. You have to prepare and you have to cut. Don't imagine that detailed, laborious preparation is too dull or beneath your dignity. It's really worthwhile to do very pedestrian work in preparing for effective communication. You should write out actual scripts, sentence by sentence, word by word. You should say them to yourself, or better still, practice with your friends and your colleagues and your family. Tweak them to make them clearer, simpler, and more engaging. And then you should do this kind of magical step of committing them to memory, but then forgetting that you've memorized them so that you can reproduce them again when you need them, as if spontaneously. Don't worry that detailed, careful preparation is going to make you wooden. If you do the preparation well, it'll actually do just the opposite. It'll let you be more relaxed and engaged, more connected with the person you're talking to, because you're not worried, or at least you're less worried about finding the right words in the moment. The other thing I'd say, both about effective communication in short formats and the crucial role of preparation to do this effectively, is don't imagine that this work is just a distraction from your scientific work of no value to it. Working with alternative ways of expressing what you do and seeking clearer ways to convey it in simple, concrete terms, I find very often helps my own understanding of what I'm doing as well. And in fact, working to express why what I do and what I've learned is important really helps get me out of a kind of a tunnel vision, and sometimes helps me see important questions that are embedded in my work or related to it that I want to pursue that I wouldn't have noticed without going through that exercise. So those are a few remarks that are focused on the very shortest of communication opportunities, the true elevator speech, or the true walk down the corridor and you find yourself beside someone you want to talk to. Of course, there's a lot of high-value opportunities that are longer as well. There's a lot of communication opportunities that are 5 or 10 minutes. You can convey a lot in that time with careful planning. But the risk I draw your attention to as the opportunity and the time gets a little longer is don't imagine that as it gets longer you can just fill the space up with longer exposition. So you might be tempted to say, if 15 seconds is 3 sentences, then 5 minutes is 60 sentences. No, don't do that. The big change that happens in the move to a 5 or 10 minute conversation is the opportunity for dialogue. Now, maybe some of the other panelists disagree with me, but I'd suggest that in the very shortest, the 10 or 15 second thing, you actually don't have a lot of chance for dialogue. It's all about having a very, very short message that you can convey, and maybe creating the opportunity for a longer conversation. But even at 5 minutes, you have the chance to ask questions and to get the person or people you're talking to ask questions. That makes them more engaged. It connects you more with them, and it also puts you in a position to know more about where they are in terms of their knowledge and their concern. When you're thinking about an opportunity of 5 or 10 minutes, preparation is still crucial, but now it's not just precisely refining, scripting, memorizing, and then reproducing a couple of really cogent, brief sentences, but it's more like preparing a densely branched tree of possibilities. Because now when you prepare, you have to think about your questions, their responses, their questions, your responses, alternative directions the conversation may go, including places you want to steer it if the chance comes up and places you want to avoid. Communication opportunities can be linked. The 15 seconds, if it's successful, may be the opening for a 10-minute conversation. The 10-minute conversation, if it's successful, may be the opening for a 30 or a 60-minute conversation later on. As the time available expands, though, don't make the mistake of thinking that because the duration you have is similar to what you might have for an academic or a scientific presentation, that you should treat it like an academic or a scientific presentation. Even as you go to longer meetings, you have to always think about compact expression of key ideas, leading with crucial ideas, connecting to the people you're speaking to by anticipating and thinking through it in advance, but even better by asking questions and letting them ask questions, and leading with what's most important. There's a couple of pitfalls related to time management. The single biggest one to think about is don't try to do too much. Don't try to cram it all in. Don't imagine that if you don't get to say it all, it's not worth saying anything. Fit the message and the aims to the available time. Within the limited time available, don't waste your time on warm-ups. Lead with the most important message stated simply. If elaboration or qualifications are needed, say them later. And finally, don't do what I do. My wife says that when I find that a speaking opportunity is shorter than I expect, I respond by speeding up the number of words per minute in proportion. That's not a good idea. Don't talk fast, never sound rushed, even if the time available to you is really short. Sounding rushed just sends all kinds of bad messages and often is one of the things that will turn off the people you're talking to. Okay. That is a few thoughts on how you think about the range of time that might be available to you. What are your goals? Think in advance about your aims and your goals. You might have a bunch of different ones. Here's a few examples that I came up with. You might have specific points you want to convey. You might want to convey general background. You might think that the people or person you're talking to has an important misunderstanding that you want to correct, although I'd flag that as a dangerous aim for various reasons. You might want to get them more concerned. You might want to argue for an action. You might want to convey something broader about the area you work in or about yourself. Maybe your aim is just to set yourself up as a trustworthy source. Any of these can be suitable. The only advice I have about your goal is to be clear with yourself, know or decide in advance, if possible, what your goal is, and note that you're going to say different things and prepare differently depending on your goal. Finally, a couple of things to say about your audience. You should always prepare your message in straightforward, non-technical terms. You should always take advantage of images, stories, analogies, or metaphors if they're apt in conveying your work. You have to try them out and think carefully and find ones that are really suitable. If you want to convey more detail or complexity, that's great if you get the opportunity, but you should think about it as a step-by-step process. You lead with the core, simplest, most important message, and then as there's the opportunity and you see people are interested, give more detail. Now, most of my talking is to policy audiences generally defined, so if I don't know anything more about my audience's specific knowledge, I assume that they're a general reader of the New York Times or The Economist, an intelligent, informed person with zero specific relevant expertise. For different groups or different people, you might make a different default assumption, but you should always be prepared to adjust based on what you get back from the dialogue. The single biggest message to make about simplifying is do your simplification without a hint of patronizing or arrogance. This is again something where you have to turn to your friends and family and ask them to be ruthless in rooting out any errors you make in this respect. Both speakers before me have already conveyed the importance of thinking about and relating to what your audience cares about, so I don't think I'm going to repeat myself or repeat them by going over those points again, except to hammer again the same message, which is think about it in advance and prepare and try to meet the people or person you're speaking to where they are. And I see I'm out of time. I have not engaged in good time management myself, and so I'm not going to just talk faster. I'm going to say that there are a bunch of other pitfalls, but I think the core messages I've conveyed already about being clear about your goals, about responding and preparing your message with respect to the time that you have available, and about thinking in advance and clearly about your audience in terms of what they know and what they care about, really are the core messages for effective communication. So I'm going to close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Jalonne and Sean. I think we have some time left for questions, and we've already started getting some in, so feel free to submit your questions through the chat box, which is in the left corner of your screen. The first question is from Anna. How can you tell when you've lost your audience, and how do you recover their attention? Ted, do you want to take the first crack at that one?
Well, it's kind of obvious. The same way as you know when somebody's thinking about something else when you engage them in a social conversation. So one way of recovering their attention is to kind of name it explicitly and say, I can see I've lost you. Am I giving you more detail than you're interested in here? Another way is to try to be very direct in connecting it to some concern of this person. Ask them a question. Say, oh, is this something you don't think is important? Because I think you really ought to think this is important, and here's why. Naming it, identifying it, and responding by going a level up is one possibility. But I'd love to hear the other speakers' ideas.
This is Sean. I think that Ted, I would pretty much frame it the same way. I as I mentioned in my remarks, I think always sort of trying to turn the conversation around by posing questions is one way of at least exploring how that interest was lost, and so that would be my default too. But I like the way that Ted sort of framed it as being sort of brutally direct and saying, boy, there's a disconnect here. Is there something that I'm missing? And being somewhat provocative, and that alone might sort of re-grab them.
Yeah, this is Jalonne. I would just add, and I agree with both of the responses. Oftentimes, you can tell you've lost your audience when you get a blank stare, or people are sleeping, or I think texting, because we are so kind of multitasking with technology right now. And some of the things that I've attempted to do when sitting in meetings where, again, you have limited time is to wait for that person to finish texting and just kind of sit there and stare and smile and then turn the question or a question back at them. And that seems to be pretty effective, that, okay, you're not going to, kind of not take my time by texting away. So that's just something that I would add.
Thank you. All right, the next question comes from Martin. He asks, what is the position of humor? Sean, do you want to answer that one first based on your elevator pitch that you gave us?
Well, that's interesting that, Martin, that you asked that question. I mean, in someone, Martha in the chat sort of got it, that in some ways, like in using that term, the existential threat prevention specialist, was an attempt at humor, sort of capturing sort of a dark issue, nuclear weapons, in a way that sort of gets people thinking. But as a general rule, I think humor is a good thing. But as I learned, that that doesn't necessarily work in every case. I mean, I think humor puts people at ease, and but again, it's really if you're talking about a serious matter, you have to be very careful about your use of humor. So yes, but again, using all the guidelines sort of laid out in this conversation, just be very thoughtful about when you might use it.
May I comment on that too? This is Ted. Humor is great if it's apt and if it's at your own expense. I mean, if many of you listening on the line are scientists, then I'm going to guess many of you are teachers or academics, so you often have to think about whether you use humor or how you use humor effectively in teaching situations. Most jokes end up being at someone's expense, and I think it's a lot better and it relates you better to your audience if you can find relevant ones that are at your expense. Don't take risks about something that might treat a really serious concern flippantly or might intentionally or unintentionally be disparaging or an insult to someone else.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question comes from Jen. How do you determine the right level of technical content for the elevator pitch for the specific audience?
I'll pick that up if nobody else wants to.
Yeah, go ahead, Ted.
There isn't really a general answer to that because every audience you interact with, it's like, where are you? Who are they? What's the event about? So you can make a default presumption about what they know based upon who they are and what setting you met them in. So, for example, a scientist outside your field is very different from a concerned community member who asks you a question when you make a presentation at a public meeting on some controversial issue. I like to do parallel preparation of messages for a couple of default presumptions about levels of technical information. So an intelligent high school student or high school grad, my 15-year-old son, have a way of conveying things that he would understand and find engaging and interesting. And then there's a second that is kind of the default assumption in a policy or professional setting, which is the generally educated college grad, no specific scientific expertise. Have those both ready, and then as you get feedback that you've missed the mark, have alternatives available to tune up or down the level of specificity and detail depending on what you learn.
Great. Did either Sean or Jalonne want to answer that as well?
This is Sean. I could add one thing. This is a really relevant question when it comes to interacting with legislative staff, aides for legislators or members of Congress, and legislative staff typically have to know a little about a lot of things, and so what I often do is that very simple question of how much do you know about. This week, for example, we're doing a lot of work on missile defense issues, so I might ask a question like, how much do you know about the ground-based mid-course defense interceptor? Something which might sound like a technical question, but for a defense aide on Capitol Hill, it's a legitimate question. If their member of Congress serves on the appropriate committee, they might say, "Oh yeah, I just got briefed on that just last week," and that helps you to determine sort of what comes next in the conversation. So again, sort of asking that question, well, how much do you know about X? It helps to sort of answer that.
Great. Our next question comes from Sarah. What about when you have a mix of people in the audience with potentially opposing interests? Jalonne, do you want to take the first shot at that one?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that is important is depending on the audience, again, and I'll just kind of relate it to going into an office, on the Hill or a congressional office where you're going to get some opposition, and really understanding what, again, your definition of success is. And so, with this audience, are you trying to convince them to do something, or are you just sharing information? And oftentimes, as scientists and technical folks, I think, you want to share information, and sometimes it's really important just to plant that seed and then kind of, see both sides of the coin, know what kind of, the opposition might say, so really trying to reframe the arguments that you think they're going to come back with, and then, using it as kind of like an educational piece that really caters to the interest of the wide audience. And I think sometimes that's more important than getting into kind of a heated argument, with whomever you're trying to communicate with, because if that does happen, then they'll simply just shut down and turn you off. So I think when you have a mix of people in the audience, I think conveying as much as you can both sides of the story, still getting your point across, trying to reframe what the opposition might come back with, and then, again, hoping that you've planted the seed for folks to really think about what you've brought to the table in a different way.
May I comment on that too? I think speaking to a group that has different or widely ranging views or interests on an issue is not nearly so difficult or troublesome as speaking to a group that has a very wide level of prior familiarity or detail of knowledge. I'd say with a group that has kind of a sort of a consistency of knowledge but really wide-ranging views, you have a fabulous opportunity by conveying relevant scientific or other information to help them converge on the structure of their disagreement, help them understand what they're arguing about and what things are fair bases for kind of contending political views and what things are just things we know that aren't really up for dispute. And I think that can be a very powerful contribution to kind of elevate the debate and elevate the discussion on issues. It's more challenging when you have an audience that have a wide range of levels of familiarity and you have to, say, both simultaneously field questions that come from kind of zero and questions that presume a very specific starting point. For that situation, my advice is start at sort of the 35th percentile, so aim kind of below the median with where you start, and then toss out elaborations or specifics to those who are interested or curious about them, all the while saying things like, if you're not familiar with this, you don't need to worry about this. I'm answering so-and-so's question. Here's the core message.
This is Sean. I'd like to just add a couple of things as well to this. I think we are very accustomed to this. I've spent the last 3 years working on the issue of nuclear power safety, which of course is a key issue for UCS. And as some of you may know, we have a somewhat nuanced position where we're neither for nor against nuclear power. And needless to say, that puts us in a position where we're taking it from both sides, if you will. And I've had the great pleasure of spending some time on the road with Dave Lochbaum, who's our head of our nuclear safety project, and he's he's been in that hot seat, and he has this amazing ability to stay calm. I think that's sort of a very, very big piece of advice when there's sort of competing views and passion in a room, that you're the person who sort of stays above the fray, particularly in your response to people who are venting their feelings and anger toward you as a speaker. But at the same time, be true to your beliefs. Don't try to be one person to the person with this view and another person to another view. Be honest where you disagree with someone. And if you believe what you're articulating and what you're trying to persuade others, stick with that. And lastly, I think there's a tendency on the part of people in public speaking engagements when they're getting badgered to, and I'd actually be interested to see if Ted and Jalonne agree with this, but don't necessarily take it upon yourself to deal with that unruly person who won't be quiet or tries to dominate a conversation. I think in most cases someone else will do that for you. If someone's being a jerk, it's probably not only you who knows and feels that, but any number of people will feel that. I don't know if Ted or Jalonne sort of agree with that advice, but I found that's worked very well for Dave, for example.
I think that's good advice, with the additional proviso that intense opposition and strong feeling in a public setting doesn't necessarily make someone a jerk.
That's right, absolutely.
And I think it's important to be a calming presence. One way that I find useful is when dealing with a hostile or adversarial questioner to try to identify and clearly state things they're saying that I agree with and things that they're saying that I don't agree with, and so help to delimit the differences.
Thank you very much for answering that question, all of you. And we are running short on time, so we're going to do one last question. And for all of the other excellent questions that we've gotten but don't have a chance to answer, we're going to try to answer those by email later. So our final question is from Kathleen. How does your elevator pitch change when one ultimate goal is to obtain a job or contract opportunity in addition to spreading the word about what you care about? Ted, do you want to answer that one first?
I'll take a crack at it. Again, here's another way I sound like a broken record, because everything I say is it depends. It depends on the person and the setting and the prior knowledge. But I think the single most important thing you have to do first when you want to cultivate someone for a future relationship, whether that means you want them to call on you for advice or whether you want them to support your work financially, the first thing you have to do is establish your credibility. That is different depending upon what the scope of the playing field is. I mean, in a scientific meeting where you're talking to the program officer from the National Science Foundation who writes grants in your area, it takes a different set of things to establish your credibility than if it is a foundation officer with general environmental interests or a philanthropist in your city who you know is supporting scientific environmental activities. Get credibility, get a relationship, and you can often tell when it's an appropriate time to take the step toward making an explicit or an implicit pitch. This important work has had a lot of difficulty getting funding support because of this and this, and in order to do these other things, we really need more support. That's all.
Jalonne, do you have anything to add to that, or I certainly have a couple of thoughts.
I guess just quickly, I would just add, and I haven't had a lot of work in this area, but starting to have to ask for funding. I think one of the most important things, and I guess the situations that I've been in, is to just really say something to continue the conversation, because oftentimes, it could be awkward, again, depending on where you're at, to kind of have that long, in-depth conversation about, my research has been, kind of in this area, and do you support this? But I think just kind of saying, hey, or what I've used is, I hear you're with such and such foundation. I would love to find out some of the things that you all are interested in, or what are you funding? Can we continue this conversation later? Because I think then you can kind of, if you don't know who you're talking to, at least kind of do your homework so you can, come off a little bit educated about, and kind of align what you're doing with some of the funding streams that they're looking at. So I would just add that piece.
I would just, in the spirit, Ted's spirit of being a broken record, I'm going to do the same and just, re-emphasize the importance of asking questions. I mean, sort of one of my rules of thumb is, particularly in the context of trying to get a job or a contract, asking questions and getting them to talk. The more they talk, the more you learn about their needs and their interests, and that's the intelligence you need to help, frame that pitch or that proposal or that, cover letter or follow-up letter to your initial interview. So get them talking, ask them good questions, and that's going to, help you be in good standing with them.
Thank you so much, and we're going to wrap up now. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll be following up with you after the webinar to share some of the resources that were mentioned today, and I'd also like to point out that we'll be posting the recording of the webinar on the Science Network workshop page next week. If you'd like to go back and rewatch it or pass it along to colleagues, it'll be at ucsusa.org/SciNetWorkshops. Sorry, we're having a little technical difficulty over here. It's all right. I just wanted to give you some actions that you can take right now to practice your pitch and make your voice heard. So you can tell the Senate to support the Climate Resilience Fund, protect our national landmarks. You may have read the recent report that UCS did or seen similar reports that UCS has put out like this before, but have you ever taken the time to personalize the letter that we're asking you to send? You can significantly increase the impact of your letter by including a paragraph about how important the issue is to you and why, as an expert, you're concerned about it. And better yet, you can go to senate.gov and click Contact at the very bottom and give your senator a call and give them your pitch and tell them why you're concerned about this issue. This is a great opportunity for you to practice your pitch with a Senate staffer. You can also send a letter to the President telling him to take our nuclear missiles off hair trigger alert. And just like the climate resilience action, personalizing your letter is going to make a much bigger impact. So make sure you identify why this issue matters to you as an expert and a little bit about yourself. Finally, we have 2 opportunities for early career scientists. There is a call for submissions from the Journal for Science Policy and Governance, a special edition on healthy food policy. This is open to current students and recent graduates, and for more information, you can visit their website or you can visit the Science Network page under Get Involved. The deadline for this is June 20th. Feel free to share it around to any friends and colleagues you think may be interested. And you can also apply for the Ecological Society of America's Eco-Service Award. This is open to current students who are attending ESA in August of this year. For more information, you can visit their website or you can visit the Science Network page. The deadline for this is coming up this weekend on June 1st. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Another big thank you to our speakers. Our next set of webinars will start in September, but we hope to hear from you before then, so stay in touch through our website. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.